My name is Claire Whitman. I'm 29 years old, and I have spent most of those years being the daughter my mother could depend on, right up until the moment I became the daughter she could throw away. 3 weeks after I brought my son Noah home from the hospital, while I was still learning how to function on 2 hours of sleep, my mother knocked on my bedroom door at 7:30 in the morning and said, without even looking at the baby in my arms, "Pack your things. Derek and Vanessa need this room for the nursery. You have until the weekend." I stared at her like she'd just spoken a language I'd never heard before. But that sentence wasn't the part that broke me. What I found in my father's desk 2 days later was, and what I did that Friday afternoon, quietly, with one phone call and a single piece of paper none of them knew existed, they never saw coming. Welcome back to Revenge Camera Stories, where the invisible daughter finally becomes impossible to ignore. If you've ever been the child who gave everything just to be treated like you belonged, hit that subscribe button, because this one starts with a newborn and ends with a deed, and I need you to see every single name on it. I read my mother's words 3 times, waiting for the part where she said she was joking, or stressed, or needed to sit down and talk about options. That part never came. She just stood in the doorway of what had been my childhood bedroom in the house. I'd moved back into 6 months pregnant and alone, and she looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you're trying to rearrange. "Derek and Vanessa need the space," she repeated, slower this time, like I was the one being unreasonable. "The baby's coming in 4 months, and this is the biggest bedroom. You understand." I looked down at Noah, 3 weeks old, asleep against my chest in a milk-stained onesie. My son, her grandson, the one she'd held exactly twice since we came home from the hospital, both times for photos she posted to Facebook with captions about being blessed. "Mom," I said quietly, because I've learned that the calmer I sound, the harder it is for people to paint me as hysterical later. "Where exactly do you expect me to go with a 3-week-old baby?" She waved a hand. "You'll figure it out. You always do. That's your gift, Claire. You land on your feet." And then she walked out, and I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, in the room where I'd done my homework and cried over boys and packed for college, holding my sleeping son. And I understood for the first time in my life that landing on my feet had never been a compliment. It had been a permission slip. Permission for my family to push me over and over, because I'd always find a way not to break. Until now, I'd never asked myself what I'd broken on the inside, so they wouldn't have to watch me fall. You have to understand how a thing like this gets built, because nobody tells you at 29 that you're disposable all at once. They teach it to you slowly. One, Derek needs this more, at a time. The first one I remember clearly was my college fund. I was 17, acceptance letter to Penn State in my hand, when my father sat me down and explained that Derek, my younger brother by 4 years, needed braces and travel soccer and a math tutor, and that the fund Grandma had set up for me, well, it had been reallocated. "You're smart, Claire," he'd said. "You'll get scholarships. Derek needs the support." I got the scholarships. I also got $40,000 in student loans. Then it was my car, the used Honda I'd saved for working doubles at the diner, handed over to Derek the week he turned 16 because he needs reliable transportation for school and practice. I got the rusted Civic that barely started in winter. Then it was my apartment. I'd finally gotten my own place after graduation. A small 1-bedroom I was proud of, when Mom called saying Derek needed somewhere to stay, rent-free while he figured things out, after dropping out of college, for the second time. "Just for a few months, Claire. You know how he struggles." He stayed for a year and a half. I stayed on my friend's couch and paid rent on an apartment I wasn't living in because breaking the lease would have cost me 3 months. Rent I didn't have. Each time I told myself it was temporary. Each time I told myself it proved I was the strong one, the dependable one, the one they could count on. And each time I got smaller in their eyes until I wasn't a daughter at all. I was a resource, a thing to be shifted around to make room for the person who actually mattered. My brother, Derek, the golden child who could do no wrong even when he did nothing right. I'd moved back into my parents' house 6 months pregnant because my ex, Noah's father, had made it very clear that fatherhood wasn't part of his plan. About 5 seconds after I told him I was keeping the baby. I'd been living alone, barely covering rent on a teacher's salary. And when Mom offered the room, she'd made it sound like love. "Come home, honey. Let us take care of you during this time." I should have known better. I should have remembered that in my family, taking care of me always came with terms and conditions I wouldn't see until it was too late. The timing is what made it so much worse. And I need you to understand just how vulnerable I was in that moment, because it matters. 3 weeks postpartum, I was still healing from an emergency C-section that had left me with a 6-inch scar and strict orders not to lift anything heavier than the baby. I was nursing every 2 hours through cracked, bleeding nipples. I hadn't slept more than 90 minutes at a stretch since Noah was born. I was still wearing maternity leggings because nothing else fit. And I cried at least once a day for reasons I couldn't even name. And my mother looked at that version of me, holding a newborn who was entirely dependent on me for survival, and decided I was in the way. Not because I'd been a bad guest. Not because I'd failed to help around the house or contribute or show gratitude, but because my brother's wife, Vanessa, who wasn't even pregnant yet, had announced at Sunday dinner. The week before that, they were officially trying, and Mom had spent the last 7 days turning that announcement into a full-scale remodel of my entire existence. Derek and Vanessa needed the big bedroom for when the baby came. They needed the upstairs bathroom because Vanessa got nauseous. They needed my parking spot because Vanessa shouldn't have to walk too far in her condition. Vanessa, who was not pregnant. Vanessa, who worked part-time at a boutique and spent her afternoons at spin class. Vanessa, who looked at me the day I came home from the hospital and said, "Wow, Claire, you look exhausted. Have you tried concealer?" That Vanessa needed my room, and I, with an actual baby in my actual arms, needed to pack. I called my best friend Jessica that night while Noah slept in the bassinet next to my bed, and I tried to explain it in a way that didn't sound as insane as it felt. "She's kicking you out?" Jessica said, her voice hitting a pitch that would have woken the baby if he wasn't so deeply asleep. "You just had major surgery. You have a newborn. Where does she think you're going to go?" "She said I'd figure it out," I whispered. "She said it's my gift." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Jessica said something I didn't fully understand until much later. "Claire, you know that house was your dad's parents' house, right? Like your grandparents. I remember you telling me that." I did know that, vaguely. My dad's parents, Grandma and Grandpa Whitman, had bought the house in 1968. They'd raised my dad there. When Grandpa died, Grandma had lived there alone until she passed away 6 years ago, and then Mom and Dad had moved in. It had always just been the family house in my head, a place that existed without paperwork, the way childhood homes do. "Yeah," I said. So, Jessica said slowly. "Who actually owns it? Like legally?" I didn't have an answer, and for the first time since my mother had stood in my doorway and erased me, I started asking a different question. Not where was I going to go, but whose house was I being erased from? The next morning, while Mom was at her book club and Derek was at work, I did something I hadn't done since I was 12, years old and looking for Christmas presents. I went into my father's office and I opened his desk. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Maybe a lease, maybe a mortgage statement, maybe just something that would tell me whether the space I was being shoved out of was even theirs to control. The desk was exactly as it had always been, organized to the point of sterile. My father is a man who labels his label maker, and every drawer had a purpose. I found the file in the second drawer down on the left, in a hanging folder marked Property, in his meticulous block print. Inside were 3 documents: a property tax statement from last year, a homeowner's insurance policy, and a deed. I pulled the deed out carefully, like it might burn me, and I sat down in my father's chair and I read it. When you grow up in a house, you assume you know its history. You assume the people living there are the people who own it. You assume that the roof over your head is your parents' roof, and that makes you a guest in their generosity. I had assumed all of those things, and every single one of them was wrong. The deed, recorded with the county in October 2006, transferred ownership of 428 Maple Street from Dorothy and Harrison Whitman to 3 people: my father, Robert Whitman, and his 2 children, Derek Allen Whitman, Claire Marie Whitman. Me. I read it 4 times. I took a photo of it with my phone. I read it again on the screen, zooming in on my own name like it might disappear if I looked away. The deed was clear. When my grandmother had updated her estate plan, she hadn't left the house to my father. She'd left it to all of us. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. My father had signed as trustee for me and Derek since we were minors at the time. But the ownership was ours. I had lived in this house on and off for 29 years, and I had never once known that 1/3 of it was legally mine. I owned the room my mother was trying to kick me out of. I owned the walls, the floor, the closet where I'd hung my homecoming dresses and my teaching clothes, and now the 3 outfits I rotated through. because nothing else fit my postpartum body, and nobody had ever told me. I sat in that chair holding the deed, and I felt something I had not felt in weeks, maybe years. Not anger, not yet. Just a cold, clean clarity. The kind you get when a number finally balances. My family had spent my entire life moving me around like furniture, and the whole time, I'd had a legal right to stay exactly where I was. They'd just made sure I never knew it. I didn't go to my mother first. I went to a lawyer, because I've learned that when you're about to have a conversation that could end badly, you bring facts, not feelings. I called the number for an attorney Jessica's mom had used for estate stuff, and I got an appointment for the next afternoon. My dad took a late lunch to watch Noah, which felt absurd given what I was about to do. But I smiled and thanked him, and handed over the diaper bag like everything was fine. The attorney's name was Margaret Sosa, and she looked at the deed for maybe 30 seconds before she set it down and looked at me over her reading glasses. "You didn't know about this," she said. Not a question. "Not until yesterday." She nodded slowly. "And your parents are asking you to leave." "My mother is. My father hasn't said much, but he's not stopping her." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Ms. Whitman, this is a straightforward tenancy in common. You own 1/3 of this property outright. Your brother owns 1/3. Your father owns 1/3. No single owner can force another owner to vacate without a buyout or a partition action, which would require going to court. In plain English, they can't kick you out. That's your house as much as it is theirs." I felt something in my chest unlock. "So if I just stay?" "If you stay, you're within your legal rights. They'd have to sue you to remove you. And given that you're a co-owner with a newborn and nowhere else to go, no judge is going to side with them. You're not a tenant. You're an owner." I thought about my mother's face in the doorway. "You have until the weekend." I thought about every time I'd been moved, shifted, tucked out of sight to make room for Derek. And I thought about the word Margaret had just used, owner. "What if I want to make sure this doesn't happen again?" I asked. Margaret smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who'd seen this exact story before. "Then we make sure everyone in that house understands exactly what the deed says. And we do it in writing." I went home with a folder. Inside it was a copy of the deed. A letter from Margaret on law firm letterhead explaining the ownership structure. And a printout of the statute about tenancy in common that Margaret had highlighted in yellow. I also went home with a plan. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to do what I'd done my whole life. Show up prepared, speak quietly, and let the facts do the work. But this time the facts were on my side. I waited until Friday, the day I was supposed to be gone. I packed nothing. Instead, I fed Noah, changed him, put him down for his morning nap, and then I walked downstairs, to the kitchen where my mother was sitting, with her coffee and her phone, scrolling through paint samples for the nursery she was planning in my room. "Mom," I said, "we need to talk." She didn't look up. "If this is about the timeline, Claire, I've been very generous. You've had almost a week." "It's about the house," I said, and I set the folder on the table in front of her. She glanced at it the way you glance at junk mail. "What is this?" "It's the deed to this house. The one Grandma left when she died. I think you should read it." "Claire, I don't have time for—" "Oh, Mom." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move. I just stood there, and I waited until she finally looked at me. "Read it." She opened the folder. I watched her face as she scanned the first page. Confusion. Then recognition. Then something I had never, in 29 years, seen directed at me. Fear. "This doesn't—" she started. "It does," I said. "Grandma left the house to Dad, Derek, and me. Equal thirds. I own 1/3 of this house. So does Derek. So does Dad. And according to the attorney I spoke with on Wednesday, that means you can't make me leave. This is my house, Mom. Legally. It always has been." The kitchen went very, very quiet. My father appeared in the doorway. I don't know how much he'd heard, but from the look on his face, it was enough. "Claire," he started. "Did you know?" I asked, not angry. Just clear. "Did you know I was on the deed and you just never told me?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at my mother, and I had my answer. "You've known the whole time," I said. "Both of you. And you let me think I was just here on your generosity. You let me feel like I owed you for taking me in when I've owned part of this house since I was 16 years old." My mother's hands were shaking. "This house has been our responsibility. We've paid for everything. The taxes, the insurance, the repairs, and I'd be happy to contribute to those now that I know I'm an owner, I said. I'll pay my third, but I'm not leaving, and I'm not giving up my room for Derek and Vanessa's hypothetical baby when I have a real one sleeping upstairs. My father stepped forward. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Claire, you have to understand. We didn't tell you because if I knew I owned part of this house, you couldn't move me around anymore, I finished. I get it, Dad, I do. But I'm done being moved. Here's the part where I could have walked away quietly, taken my third and kept the peace, and gone back to being the dependable daughter who never made waves. And I want you to understand, part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to fold that deed back into the drawer and pretend I'd never seen it, because the alternative was standing in the wreckage of every story my family had ever told about who I was. I didn't fold it. Instead, I looked at my mother, whose face had gone pale, and I said the truest thing I've ever said in that kitchen. Mom, I have been the child you could count on my entire life. I gave up my college fund. I gave up my car. I gave up my apartment. I came home when I needed help because you offered, and I believed you wanted me here. But you didn't want me. You wanted the space I took up for someone you love more, and I'm done pretending that's the same thing. My mother's mouth opened, but nothing came out. My father looked away, and I kept going. Still calm, still steady. I'm staying in my room, the one I own 1/3 of, and if Derek and Vanessa need space for a baby, they can find it somewhere else. Because I'm not leaving this time. Not for Derek, not for you, not for anyone. My mother stood up, her chair scraping hard against the floor. How dare you? I dare, I said, because I have a piece of paper that says I can. And unless you want to take your own daughter to court to evict her and her newborn grandson, I suggest you make peace with the fact that I'm not going anywhere. She walked out. My father followed her, and I stood in that kitchen, in the house I owned but had never been allowed to claim, and I felt the kind of tired that comes after you finally stopped carrying something too heavy. I wasn't the doormat anymore. I was a co-owner, and there is no universe in which those two things can exist in the same person. The week after that was the quietest the house had ever been. My mother didn't speak to me. My father communicated in nods and murmurs. Derek, when he found out, called me selfish, entitled, and a few other things I won't repeat. Vanessa posted something vague on Instagram about family betrayal, with a black and white photo of her looking sad. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't post my side. I didn't defend myself. I just stayed, in my room, with my son, in the house I owned. And slowly something shifted. My father started paying attention to Noah. Real attention. Not photo op grandpa moments, but actual time spent holding him, walking him when he cried, sitting with me while I fed him at 2 a.m. and didn't have the energy to speak. He didn't apologize. Not with words, but he showed up. And for a man like my father, showing up was the closest thing to I'm sorry I was going to get. My mother took longer, but one morning, about 3 weeks after the kitchen showdown, I came downstairs to find her folding a load of Noah's laundry that I'd left in the dryer. She didn't say anything. She just folded the tiny onesies into perfect squares and set them in the basket. It wasn't much, but it was the first time since I'd come home that she'd done something for me without being asked. Without needing credit, without making it about her. I said, "Thank you." She nodded, and that was all. But it was enough for that day. The text that told me the whole thing had been worth it came 4 months later. Derek and Vanessa had moved into their own apartment, a small 2-bedroom they were renting across town. And one night Derek texted me a photo. It was a screenshot of a lease application, his name on the top line, and under emergency contact he'd listed me. The message under it said, "I'm sorry I didn't get it before. You deserved better. I'm trying to do better." I read it standing in my kitchen, because by then, I'd started thinking of parts of that house as mine, and I sat down on the floor, and I cried. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Not because my family had suddenly become the family I'd always wanted. They hadn't. But because my brother, the golden child who'd never had to think about what he was given or who gave it up for him, had finally looked up long enough to see me, and he'd said sorry.